Hello again, folks. Martin Lehner here from Orange Technology, and in this video I want to talk about practical security for computer networks, for your networks, your computers, your servers, all that kind of thing. Again, for those of you who don't know who I am, I live in Whitehorse in the Yukon Territory. That's in northern Canada. We border Alaska. I am 2 hours away from the Alaskan border, from the closest American or Alaskan city, I guess American city. And I own Orange Technology, as you can see there. And we are basically an MSP, or third-party IT services provider. So we have external clients who contract our services for everything from workstation troubleshooting to dealing with printers, server administration, network administration, security, voice over IP, wireless, all that kind of stuff. So if you guys have been following me a few videos ago, you'll know that I just recently did a certification course. This one, still have it on my desk. It's from Mile 2. It's called Certified Penetration Testing Engineer, CPTE. Great course, great certification. I would recommend it absolutely to anybody looking for that kind of thing. Again, if you look on my previous videos, I talk about the relevance of certifications and whether they're worth doing and all that kind of stuff. So if you want to learn about that, go to those videos. But anyways, and you know, I mean, this course was basically all about how to do penetration testing and vulnerability testing on your network. So whether it's your network, whether it's a network you administer, whatever, right? And you know, a lot of the course, so it was a 5-day course, 5 days, 4.5 days in a virtual classroom with a live instructor, and then half a day to take the exam at the end. The exam is a 2-hour exam. It is actually fairly lengthy. There are quite a few questions. They are not super hard, but they're not super easy either. They're not simple. They don't just hand these certifications out. If you don't pay attention in the 4.5 days of class, you're not going to pass the exam. That's the bottom line. So, anyway, so throughout this course, we went through, you know, how to check for open ports, how to connect to things, how to get HTTP banners from websites, and all this kind of stuff, right? And really, what it boils down to, what it comes down to, is you have to be practical with your network security, right? It's not actually that hard. It's not that complicated. It's not that difficult, but you have to be practical about it. And actually, you know what? I have to say, one of the parts, we go through a number of the providers, softwares out there that you can use to do this stuff. And one of the ones is a hosted vulnerability scanner. Qualys, Qualys, have a look at those guys. They have a hosted vulnerability scanner where basically you just plug in your web URL or the IP address of your network, and it will go and it will scan. It will scan for vulnerabilities, and it will report back with a report that will let you know what vulnerabilities it found and how you could remediate them, or what you should look at doing. So this was actually really cool. So they have a demo. You can sign up for a demo account. It gets you 10, I think, free scans. So I signed up and I did a scan on my own network, right? And it scans for so basically it does a huge port scan, right? And then if it sees things, it tries to log in, tries to find out what those services are, and so forth and so forth, right? So for example, if you have a website that has SSL, right, so port 443 is open, it will go and it will look at that. It will check, for example, it will check which version of SSL you're running. Are you running an old version? Are you running something that is outdated and is vulnerable to being attacked various ways? It will then also let you know how it could be attacked and how you could remediate that. So that's really it was actually really cool. I known about these kind of online hosted vulnerability scanners before, but I'd never actually tried one. And then again, it's something we went over in this class, so I decided, oh, you know what, I'll try it. And actually, they are really, really cool. They're really, honestly, they're really easy to use. You have to just plug in your parameters. You plug in your IP address. You plug in the basic parameters of what you want it to scan. It scans, takes anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes roughly, and then it returns back a full report. So it's not even just like it's shows you all these ports are open. It shows you a whole report of what's open, why it could be a vulnerability, anything like that. And it's quite a lengthy report, right? I mean, it again, depending on how many services you have open, yada yada, will depend how large the report is, but it is quite comprehensive. The paid version is not that cheap, I will say. It's not super cheap. But again, this is a great tool, and honestly, all you have to do is plug in the IP address, you plug in the parameters you want it to do, and that's about it, right? And then it spits this report out, and then you can go and you can remediate things if that's what you have to do, and so forth and so forth. And really what I started really finding is, again, a lot of this security stuff is very practical. It's very simple. It's very straightforward. There's nothing crazy about it. That's the thing, right? And for example, for those of you who are, look, I understand the situation is different if you're a large corporation, 4,000 users, and you offer some kind of service and you have a website, clients log on, buy things, whatever. If you're Amazon and you're selling things, obviously you must have a website. You must deal with that, right? But honestly, in my space, so I'm a third-party IT services provider, right? I have clients. Most of my clients are small businesses, medium businesses, nonprofits, NGOs, governmental organizations, et cetera, et cetera. Most of my clients, and I would probably say that this is going to be true for a lot of smaller entities, so when you have 10, 20, 30 workstations, there's not a lot of external services that need to actually be open, right? So even if your client or the company you work for or whatever, if they have a website, they have something where clients can log into and things like that, a lot of that stuff these days is hosted, right? It's hosted elsewhere. It's hosted in the cloud. My website, orangetechnology.ca, all one word, you can go and have a look. That's hosted in the cloud. I'm not hosting that locally, right? Honestly, it doesn't get a whole lot of traffic, so really there's no need to host it locally. But also, why would I host it locally? A, I'm using my own bandwidth. B, I have to keep a system up and running for that. I have to make sure that system's up and running 24/7. C, that system is now vulnerable, right? If somebody attacks it, they are attacking my local network, right? They're trying to exploit it. So again, D, there's overhead. There's administrative overhead. I have to make sure I'm patching that system. I have to make sure I'm dealing with the security vulnerabilities that are there. And again, I would say, with the advent of cloud computing and all this stuff, why would you have something like that hosted by yourself? I understand if you're a large entity and you have it in-house because it's something that, literally tens of thousands of people access, and you need to be able to, whatever. I understand if you do have it, but I would say for most smaller entities, there's no point in having that kind of thing, that kind of publicly accessible thing hosted locally on a network. So really, when you think about it, there's not really that much that has to be exposed to the web as a whole. There really isn't, right? I mean, I will say most of my clients, the most prominent thing that most of my clients have in common that's open to the web is some sort of a VPN, right? So it's some sort of an SSL or an IPsec VPN that's open to the internet, where people can log in and access things remotely. That's probably the number one thing, right? And of course, there's security implications for that. Absolutely there is, and you have to deal with those. But again, the majority of my clients don't have port 80 open, SSL for HTTP services. Most don't have FTP. 90% none of them have a telnet service or things like that. And this is where I talk about the practical application of security. The fewer things you have open to the web, the smaller your attack surface. So the attack surface is basically what is on your network that can be attacked from the internet, right? From the world at large. And basically the attack surface is, what services do you have open and running? Do you have an HTTP server? Do you have a telnet server? Do you have a FTP server? Do you have VPN open, right? And the more things you have open, the larger that attack surface is, right? Because again, generally, all these services don't run on one particular machine or one particular piece of equipment. So of course, if you have HTTP on one server and you have telnet on another, and you have FTP running on another, and you have VPN on something different, then you have multiple systems that are exposed to the internet at large, right? So again, based on all of this, really what you need to look at when it comes to security is you need to look at what services are open and what is accessible from the internet. This gets into a different discussion that I have been very irritated with for a very long time, because I've seen a lot of providers do this kind of thing. A lot of services that are open to the internet are done so for convenience. They're done so because it's easy to do. The number one security hole that I have seen on production environments, production networks that are running, is RDP open to the web as a whole. So RDP, for those of you who don't know, is the remote desktop protocol. It allows you to basically log into a system and pull up a remote desktop connection. Just about every version of Windows has this. Windows Server has it. The desktop operating systems of Windows have it, all the way back to, I know XP has it at a minimum. And this is basically how you can easily access a remote machine, whether it's locally in a LAN or whether it's over the internet. You can locally access it, and you can see the desktop and basically run that machine as if you're sitting in front of it. Now, the problem with RDP is if you open it to the internet at large, then you basically get a login, a username and password prompt that you can sit there and try as long as you need to. Unless you've set up very specific rules, very specific things, you can basically sit there as long as you want to, and you can try to figure out what the password is, right? And again, will this generate log files? Yes, of course it will. Do most people look at log files? No, they don't. So essentially, an attacker can sit there and they can spend days, weeks, months, right, going through a password cracker and just trying to figure out what that password is, right? And I mean, of course, you can have an ultra super secure password, but at some point it will get cracked, right? That's just a fact. At some point, if somebody is determined enough, they will crack that password. So again, this is one of these things that personal opinion, this is my opinion, RDP open to the web at large is laziness. It is total and utter laziness. I understand why it's useful. You can do it to a Windows server, and then literally you can manage that Windows server from home. You can do, patch updates and Windows updates and things like that, security updates, and then you can reboot that thing in the middle of the night. You do it at 11 o'clock before you go to bed. Nobody's in the office. Nobody gets disturbed by it. It's really easy, right? It's really convenient. I understand why people do it and why they use it. The problem is you are creating what is, in my opinion, the largest security hole, or one of the largest security holes that can exist on a Windows-based computer network by doing that. So by doing that, in my opinion, you are creating one of the largest practical, let's call it practical security vulnerabilities, security holes on a network. Again, that is my opinion. Others will have different opinions. People will talk about how the communication's encrypted and all this nonsense. But basically, you are presenting the world with a username and password box for access into your network. This is a problem, right? there are ways. I would argue that actually I don't like remote desktop. I think it's too common. I think a lot of people use it. A lot of people know how to use it. It's very simple to use. I prefer more. Um, I prefer to use tools that are less well known, but basically achieve the same thing. So I mean, I won't get into that in this video what those tools are, but basically I prefer tools that less people use and perhaps have more authentication in them. Um, that's my opinion. That's what I prefer to see. So that being said, there are ways to still make RDP more secure. One of those things is this is really simple, right? So I mean, if you have a basic computer network and you're opening RDP to the web, most networks will have some kind of router or firewall behind the modem. So you have to do some port forwarding, right? So if somebody tries to connect to the public IP address of the network and you're trying to use remote desktop protocol, the firewall, the router needs to know where to send that request. So you have to create rules, network address translation, NAT. You have to create a rule that says if somebody tries to connect to the public IP address using the port required for RDP, where do I send that internally? And then you point to your internal server's IP address or whatever system you're trying to access. If you're doing that, then you're already in the firewall or router, you're already creating these rules. So why not limit it to specific IP addresses? Again, if this is for you as a systems administrator and you're pretty much doing this from home, then why don't you plug in your home IP address to only allow your home external IP address to be able to connect to that service? Because then at least somebody has to go through the next step of spoofing your home IP address in order to be able to try to connect to RDP. So instead of somebody just going out to the web and just scanning port 3389, which is the port that RDP runs on, and then coming back, okay, these networks are open. If they try to scan your network's public IP address, it'll show as closed because your firewall or router will not allow the traffic through because it's not coming from the public IP address of your house, which is the only one you've allowed to pass that kind of traffic through. That's a minimum, right? That, in my opinion, that is the absolute minimum you would have to do if for some reason you have to have RDP open, for whatever reason again. That's my opinion. That would be my opinion. That's the minimum way to secure it. The other way to secure it is, have a dedicated user that's only allowed to use RDP, so it's not every user on that machine. And there's a few other things you can do as well. If you want to look that kind of thing up, just Google how to secure our RTP connections over the web. Just Google that on Google, and it will come back with a number of recommendations on things you can do. That's the minimum. Again, my argument is you shouldn't even be doing it. I have taken over administration of networks that have been compromised and had a lot of damage done. And the first thing I noticed in the firewall was RDP is just open to the web. It's just open to the web. Again, when I asked those particular clients why, if they knew why RDP was open to the web, none of the internal staff used that at all. So you're only left with assuming that the last IT service provider did that for themselves. Or I'm not sure why they opened it. Maybe they opened it for some other reason. But bottom line is the internal staff didn't use it. When I closed that port, that firewall rule, nobody said anything. In one case, that's been a number of years now. So I know nobody internally from that organization was using that service. So again, when you think of security, when you think of keeping your network secure and all this stuff, it's honestly a practical thing. It's really a practical thing. There's not a lot that you have to really do and pay attention to and this kind of thing to practically keep your network secure. Again, if you're dealing with highly classified information and you really have to worry about state-sponsored hacking and other nations attacking you, yes, there are some very granular things you have to deal with, and There's a lot of systems you can put into place and implement and that kind of thing. But again, for practical networks, for small businesses, for NGOs, for nonprofits, this kind of thing, it's a very practical thing. You don't have to sit there and really worry about nitty gritty, fine details, NTLM hashes and all that kind of really more gritty stuff. It's very practical, right? I mean, most networks that are compromised out there get compromised because there's a basic security vulnerability that's just sitting out there, right? Some Windows Server patch that came out 3 years ago that's just never been applied, right? That is an exploit that can be used. Again, RDP to the web. That is a vulnerability that's just open, right? That any kid in a basement can sit there and just run a script that they can find online that just hammers that and eventually figures out what's a valid username and password, valid credentials, and then you're logged in, right? They're logged in and wreaking havoc on the system and on the network. And this is something that's common, right? I've seen this. I've personally seen this with so many clients where they just have all these services open to the web, especially RDP, and there's no need for it. They don't use it, right? And the only thing I can deduce in a lot of these situations is it's the previous IT provider wanting to just have easy access for administration purposes. And again, I understand that. I understand why there may be reasons for that. I understand why you may want to do that. But you also need to if you need that, or you have to do that, or you're going to do that for some certain reason, there are some simple ways you can make it more secure. Again, limit it to your own public IP address. Then at least the entire web can't access it easily. They would have to spoof your public IP address. How would they do that? They have to get that first. They've got to sniff traffic. It's not that simple, right? The harder you make it for someone to compromise your system, the more likely they are to just move on to an easier target. That's just a fact, right? That is basically security through obscurity. If it's so complex and so time consuming to deal with compromising you, they'll just move on to somebody who's easier, right? And again, that's not very... If you go through the really nitty gritty security courses and security training and stuff like that, they won't accept that by any means as a valid security method. But it's true, right? I mean, again, if you're dealing with small businesses, you're dealing with smaller organizations, you're not dealing with military or classified government or things like that. Generally, you're not being singled out. You're generally not being singled out to be hacked or compromised or anything like that. You're being attacked because there's a vulnerability and you're just an easy target. That's generally what it is. There are some cases. Look at Sony. The Sony hack. The Sony hack was basically due to, they wanted to get at Sony. And I understand that, right? I get that part. That is something where Sony was attacked. It was not a random choice, right? But again, for those of you, most of us aren't dealing with networks the size of Sony. We're not, if we're third-party IT service providers, we're generally not dealing with networks like Sony. They have their own IT staff. They are large enough. But if you're dealing with the majority of what's out there, smaller clients, smaller networks, you're doing MSP work, most of those networks aren't singled out. No, when an attacker attacks those networks and gets in, most of the time they actually don't even know who they've gotten into. They have no idea. They start looking around, trying to find things like letterhead and stuff like that to find out who they've compromised. Who is this, right? And again, that's one of those things where you have to be practical with your security. If you are practical with your security, then you're not going to have those kinds of issues, right? You're going to protect yourself pretty well. Again, I'm not saying you can't be hacked. I'm not saying it's impossible. Absolutely not. But But again, for practicality, I mean, you can spend limitless dollars on security. Cybersecurity, you can spend limitless dollars. It never ends. So at some point, you have to make a call. When is my network secure enough that I am happy with it, and I believe I'm secure enough. I have done a good enough job of being secure. I am not going to be held negligible if I do get compromised, because I have done enough that any reasonable person would have done. So that's the other thing when you look at security, is liability, right? If you do not secure your networks to a reasonable level, to a reasonable degree, then you may be held liable because you didn't do that. But again, if you are doing what's practical, if you are doing what makes sense for your size, then then if you do get hacked or compromised, that's just bad luck. That's what happens, right? You generally won't be held liable for that because you will have done the minimum standard or gone above and beyond. But again, things like RDP open to the web, that's something that, again, my opinion, that's not doing the bare minimum. That is opening your network up to attack and inviting it. Again, that's strictly my opinion. So yeah, that's I have talked about network security before. I have talked about this kind of thing. I've talked about a thread on Spiceworks that talked about this kind of thing. And again, I probably will bring it up in future videos as well, because it is something it is a topic that needs to be talked about regularly. It is something that is practical, is useful to the current day modern IT environment. So yeah, that is my 2 cents. That is my opinion on practical network security. That is my opinion. So we will leave it at that, and I will see you guys at the next video.